Get your hard hats, hammers, and duct tape out. Today, we're going to try to fix the Sacramento Kings. Chris Biderman from the Sacramento Bee joins me on today's show. We're going to try and make sense of why the Kings are so much better on the road than they are at home. Take a look at what's a roster issue versus what's a team mindset issue. And where is Kings head coach Mike Brown to blame? And where is he not to blame? That's all coming right here on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all season long. Today's episode is brought to you by the college football playoffs. They are here and you don't want to miss a moment of the action. The college football playoff presented by Allstate begins with 4 first-round games, December 20th and 21st on ESPN, ABC, TNT, and Max. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports anchor and reporter for ABC 10 News. And I hate Home Depot. I hate Lowe's. I hate those stores. Like, I am not the manly man when it comes to let me walk in and get a big piece of 2x4 and go get some power tools and build something in my backyard just because I want to. Yeah, no, that ain't me. I don't got that carpenter gene in my body. That being said, maybe I can try and put the gloves on and try and figure out how to fix this Sacramento Kings team that clearly has some cracks in the foundation, has some issues with the roof, maybe some mold growing somewhere. Like this Kings team, they're so close. They're so close. On the outside, they look like a beautiful home, but on the inside, there just clearly seem to be some issues going wrong that is keeping everything from clicking and working out the right way. Chris Biderman from the Sacramento Bee is a good friend of mine. An amazing writer, excellent reporter covering the Sacramento Kings. And one thing that Chris does is he goes on the road with the team. He and Jason Anderson of the Bee are always traveling, and he's going to be able to provide some really good perspective on why the Sacramento Kings are so much better on the road than they are at home. And he and I dig deep into the kind of the roots of the Kings issues, what we believe the issues are, and how they can be addressed, how they can be fixed. We're not claiming to be experts by any means. We're not claiming to have the solution to how the Sacramento Kings can turn their season around, but we certainly know how to identify some of the problems. And we want to hear from you too, what your solution would be to some of these problems that we identify. So feel free to chime in at any time at Matt George Sack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com, or leave your thoughts in the YouTube comment section down below. But for now, again, get your hard hats, get your hammers. Let's try and fix these Sacramento Kings with Chris Biderman. Always a pleasure to be joined by my good buddy from the Sacramento Bee, Chris Biderman, who's one of the beat writers covering the Sacramento Kings. And Chris, I brought you here to help me out with something, to provide a little perspective, because you, along with Jason Anderson, both travel, or at least one of you travels with the team and covers the team when they go out on the road. And one thing that's been pretty consistent about this group over the last 3 seasons is they seem to play a lot better on the road than at home. And unfortunately, it's getting more alarming as time goes on, as last night's loss to the Denver Nuggets is another example of this team, for some reason, just doesn't play the same way and struggles to create the same energy at home until they're down by like 15 or 20 points. From your perspective, as someone who is out there with the team on the road, sees them play on the road frequently, and is around them on the road, what is so different in your mind, or what do you see that's different in the way that they play and approach games and handle themselves on the road versus when they're in the Golden One Center?
Yeah, I've had a couple conversations about this topic with a couple of the players before, and one thing that guys have said is that at home they sort of expect an offensive run to come at some point, right? But like particularly 2 years ago, when they were, when they had to come up and they were the 3 seed, they felt like at any given moment they could author an avalanche of offense, and they had a lot of confidence that no matter what happened in the first quarter of a game, that they would string together a big run at some point. And while I do think they weren't necessarily wrong, given how good the offense was 2 years ago, it does lead to maybe a false sense of complacency that, we don't have to close out as hard in the first quarter. We don't have to pay attention to the back cuts as hard in the first quarter because we know that we could go on a 18-6 run in the third quarter and get ourselves back in the game. On the road, you don't really have that luxury, right? The crowd's against you, momentum, energy, can all be against you and can all swing in pretty dramatic ways on the road. Whereas at home, if the Kings string a couple stops together, they get a couple threes, the crowd is into it at Golden One, right? Like, so that's something that they feed off of. When they're on the road, they have to manufacture that themselves. And so I think that tends to, lead to them playing with a little bit more urgency, a little bit more physicality when they know that they don't have a crowd to energize them. All the energy that they bring, they're bringing themselves. So I think that that's definitely part of it. And I don't know, a lot of times with this team, I do think it's complacency, but I also think it's a issue of talent. Like, I think it's an issue of, everything Mike Brown harps on publicly, at least when it comes to defense, is like, all right, but do you have the defensive guys to handle those? Like, your guys could be clued in and locked into all the details, right? But you still don't have a ton of length on the perimeter. You still don't have a ton of athleticism outside of your undersized guards, right? And so I think a lot of the issues, the issues are multifaceted in that, there's a level of complacency when they do play at home because they just expect a run to come at any given point. But also there's a talent issue in that they don't have the longest, most athletic defenders. So sometimes, when it comes to defending, they really need to be clued in, whereas maybe they don't have the margin for error a team built with more length and athleticism could withstand, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. See, that's one of the things that I think bothers me most about this team is because you're 100% right. There is a talent issue in the sense that I don't think Monty McNair has done necessarily the best job of filling in this roster around the edges. But I will say now that Mike is starting Malik Monk, and I know Keegan Murray didn't play last night, but Keegan for the most part has been available. That starting five, those are your five best players on your team that are in that starting five. And that starting five, I think, is incredibly talented. Like, that's one of the most talented groups, period, the Sacramento Kings have had since the early 2000s when they went on their dream run. So that's why starts like last night against Denver frustrate me so much, because to me, with that group, it's not a talent issue. I understand out of that starting five, Malik Monk's not known for what he can do on the defensive end. Domantas Sabonis is not a rim protector, although I do think he's undervalued and underappreciated in certain areas defensively. De'Aaron Fox, we know, is an incredible defender when he wants to be. I like the start that we saw against Denver. Again, Keegan Murray didn't play, but the start that we saw against Denver is something we've seen all too common in Sacramento. It's happened too often to where, like you said, this team, I agree with them that they will explode offensively at some point inside the Golden One Center. Those moments are fun. This team, what I said last night is this team is never out of a game. But Chris, it always seems like they're always down. And it takes that desperation mode to ignite that offensive spark and ignite that defensive effort. And that's where I go, it's not a talent issue. It's a mindset issue. It's an energy issue. It's something with this group that is, they're keeping themselves back from being the best version of themselves for a full 48 minutes, which is a term that is overused in basketball because playing full 48 is very difficult to do. But that's something Malik Monk says a lot. That's something that De'Aaron Fox says a lot, putting together a full 48-minute effort. This Kings team has not been able to do that at home really at any point this season. And I look at that more as a attention to detail, like Mike Brown is talking about, or a focus issue or an effort issue more than I look at a talent issue, at least inside the Golden One Center.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I go back and forth with this. Like, we listen to Mike Brown and all of his press conferences, right? And so often he's saying the same thing over and over again. And from our standpoint in the media, we have a tendency to not necessarily roll our eyes, but say, okay, Mike Brown's been saying the same thing over and over again.
Right.
If you're in the locker room or if you're, in the meeting room or whatever, does Mike Brown's message ever get old if it is the same thing over and over again? And whose fault is that, right? And I'm not even saying it's Mike Brown's fault necessarily, because it could be any coach whose message might get old. I wonder at that point, is it up to the players to take ownership or more ownership of it? Because I think De'Aaron Fox is a good leader. I don't know that he's like a maniacal leader. I don't think he's ever gonna MF his teammates like Kobe Bryant did on the practice floor, right? I don't think Domantas Sabonis is that guy, right? So like, do they need that, and are they getting enough of that from the roster? I don't even think DeMar DeRozan is necessarily that type of guy. So I do think there's a void of, like when people talk about, what does Dylan Brooks bring Houston, or what does even Russell Westbrook bring Denver, or Draymond Green with the Warriors. There is a certain fire and a certain energy that, those guys can make hustle plays for their teams, and their guys will feed off of that. I don't really know that the Kings have a guy who, as soon as he comes into a game and does something, that it sparks everybody else, right? Like I do wonder if there's some sort of missing element on the roster of, okay, we need to follow this guy's lead because we know this guy is bringing it 1,000% of the time with 1,000% intensity, right? So I think that's certainly a multifaceted issue. Like, is that Mike Brown's issue because he's not providing that enough as a coach to where the players want to listen? Is it a Monty McNair issue to where, hey, he should go get a guy like that? Or is it a roster issue that, it's up to De'Aaron Fox and DeMar DeRozan and Domantas Sabonis to be more of that example? I think you could make a case it's really any of those three. And I think the fact that we are talking about it like it could be any of those three kind of leads us to know where the Kings are at with having these issues of urgency and intensity, particularly in home games.
Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything that you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Again, visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet on FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. My natural reaction to that is to want to take bits and pieces of all three, and I think maybe therein lies the problem. We need to find the one. And with the risk of getting virtual tomatoes thrown at the both of us through from Locked On Kings fans here, this is a conversation we've had before, both on the podcast and just between the two of us. Right. And Draymond Green is the name that keeps coming up. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Draymond Green, the person and the personality. I love him as a villain in the NBA. I think he's phenomenal for the league. I love Dylan Brooks in the NBA. I love Russell Westbrook and the chaotic energy that he brings. I think villains are fantastic for basketball. But Mike Brown brings up Draymond Green frequently. And I don't necessarily think of course it's because of the defense that Draymond Green played in his prime and still plays a little bit today with the Golden State Warriors. But it's Draymond's leadership. And I know I've shared this story before, and Mike shared it a bunch of times, but he also talks about like when he had a young LeBron James that took charge of the team and refocused them on what the Kings had been working on what the Cavs at the time had been working on all training camp long and got that team to buy in. That is what I think the problem is. I think definitely a talent issue of either not having that guy is a big thing that Monty McNair has to look at, but also while it's hard to ask more and demand more of Fox, who's played so well, and Domantas Sabonis, who's played so well, played phenomenal last night, like there is not an extension of Mike on the court that is bringing these guys together in a huddle without a timeout and saying, yo, we broke down here. We allowed a backdoor cut. We didn't box out. We're not focusing on the little things. Let's get it together. Like Draymond will grab someone by the collar and yell in their ear. While I don't necessarily think that's the best approach for a De'Aaron Fox or a Domantas Sabonis to have, just getting everybody together and going like, we're making those mistakes again. Let's focus up. Or, hey, let's not be terrible the first 6 minutes of the game and fall down by 15 points. Like, that is lacking with this group. And this has been a conversation that we've been having, and it's going to be tied back to De'Aaron Fox because, one, he's the star, and two, he's now the longest tenured King. This has been a common conversation in Fox's entire career in Sacramento. As Draymond proves, it doesn't have to be your best player. But when you don't have it, your best player is going to be looked at the most. And while De'Aaron is fired up by adversity and fired up when he gets pissed off with the referees or when some player makes the mistake of talking crap to him, right? That's where you get the best version of De'Aaron Fox. You love that. But the Kings need to find a way to create that amongst themselves, especially in a non-hostile environment like their home floor. And they just haven't been able to do that.
And Mike Brown said exactly what you're saying a couple weeks ago when he was saying we need to figure out ways to get De'Aaron Fox in that mode organically on his own, because there are going to be some nights where the Kings just need it. And again, it's not, I don't think it's necessarily a slight to De'Aaron Fox to say that that's not necessarily his personality. I think
I agree.
He would even admit that that's not his personality, right?
It's
like
not
he's
Steph.
not, yeah, he's not a maniacal, like I said, he's not going to cuss out his teammates on the practice floor when they're not playing up to his standard, right? He's just kind of a guy who's going to hoop and who's going to hang out with his family and is going to play video games and is going to do his thing. And that's,
right.
More power to him if that's what he wants. But I think if there's a void on the Kings, it is that emotional intensity that somebody, again, like Draymond or Dylan Brooks or Russell Westbrook, somebody like that provides. Because I think, that can be the difference in a lot of, like, it was a 1-point game last night. And if they were a little bit locked in a little bit sooner, that was certainly a winnable game, particularly with the way, Nikola Jokic and Murray were playing. Like, they were not efficient for the vast majority of that game. And the Kings were getting I think the stops they wanted, or for the most part, they were getting what they wanted defensively in terms of, those guys not hitting the level of shots that we're accustomed to them hitting. But then it ultimately ended up biting them because, they did become efficient late in the game. But there isn't that. I think Malik is probably the most fiery personality on that team. But, like I think you need it. You need more of that. You need more of it from elsewhere.
What fascinates me about this group too, Chris, is it feels like they so influence each other. And we see it in shooting. When one guy gets going, everybody starts to wake up shooting the basketball. We see it defensively. When one guy locks in and kind of plays hard on the defensive end, the team follows suit. When De'Aaron Fox gets pissed off, like in that Rockets game, the rest of the team kind of picks up and feeds off of that energy. But on the flip side, when it's not there, everyone's ice cold from the perimeter, or everybody's flat, or no, like it's going to be hard to expect Keegan Murray, who's quiet and barely says anything, to suddenly fire up this defensive intensity and defensive energy if the other four starters out of the gate are flat-footed and getting beat on backdoor cuts. So I think that's just the root of the issue with this Kings team is there isn't that piece or there isn't that player, or there isn't that personality that just keeps them accountable on the floor. And then I think a lot of that then gets turned around and placed on Mike Brown, who went back to his old ways of rapid fire timeouts last night. He called 2 quick timeouts in the first quarter, called another quick timeout in the second quarter. Mike Brown was burning through his timeouts early on to try and focus this team and bring this team together. I do think that there are mistakes that Mike Brown makes, sometimes frequently, when it comes to his rotations and things like that. I also think Mike is trying to do the best he can with what he has, and he's sending a message to the front office. That being said, like, I think Mike is getting the blame or the frustration of Kings fans when he's saying the right things and he's not preaching anything that's out of left field or taboo or anything like that. And the players just simply aren't executing it on the floor. And outside of taking frequent timeouts and trying to remind the guys, hey, we need to lock in, and outside of going onto the podium and saying what he said last night, what more is the guy supposed to do? I feel for Mike at this point. I can feel his frustration because he's saying this is what we're focusing on. The players are saying the same thing. They're drilling it in practice. They're focusing on it in film. And then they get to games, and even if it's only a 5-minute lull, that 5-minute lull causes them to lose.
Yeah, so I think, one of the things I wrote a little bit about when I did the Kings back-to-back in Memphis and San Antonio was his use of Keon Ellis. Right. And I think that was a pretty valid criticism because, during that stretch, the Kings were not hitting very many threes, and Keon Ellis was shooting 44% at the time,
right,
while providing obviously the best perimeter defense that they have. And so, I asked Mike, and he didn't really have a great answer other than they needed to give Kevin Huerter playing time. And, on its face, you look at the numbers in the production and you say, all right, so is Kevin Huerter really better than Keon Ellis right now? Probably not. Does Kevin Huerter have more upside in terms of what he can provide you offensively when he is hitting threes at an efficient clip? Sure, you can make that argument. But it did seem like they're playing Kevin Huerter because if they do end up making a deal before the deadline, Kevin Huerter is going to be a part of it. And not only do you want to showcase him, but you want to get him in a rhythm to make him more appealing on the trade market. And so when you have these conflicting things like needing to get Keon Ellis playing time while also needing to showcase Kevin Huerter so you can trade him, and this is just me speculating. I don't know that that's, the reason, but that's what it felt like, given that there wasn't a clear-cut answer as to why Kevin Huerter was getting those minutes over Keon Ellis. It seems to me like that was the case. And again, just speculating, but that's tough as a coach.
Yeah.
It's tough as a coach when it's hard, when you're an undersized team and the decision, because if you're an undersized team, then the decision becomes, do we get even smaller by playing Kevin Huerter and Keon Ellis in the same rotation? Not necessarily even at the same time, but it becomes more difficult to deal with teams with more size when you are trying to add another smaller guard into that mix. So yeah, I mean, I understand, I don't think any coach is perfect. I think you can look at any of the elite coaches in the league. And I'm not even saying I think Mike Brown is like one of the elite coaches in the league, but any coach in the league has their points that you can criticize, right? Like you can talk about Steve Kerr being too egalitarian. You can talk about, Greg Popovich using Jeremy Sohan as a point guard last year, right? Like you can look at some of the best coaches in the league and point to some flaws. So I think coaching in the NBA is particularly hard because of all these moving pieces. But no, like I do wonder if, like when the team goes on road trips and they fly, they're in the air for 3 or 4 hours on a plane. When they land, they go practice. Right. And like when they've had time off between games, they practice and they practice as much as any team in the NBA. You talk to players, like they will say, man, Mike loves practice. Like we are not getting a day off because Mike loves to practice, and the Kings are always practicing. And you do wonder at some point, particularly given the schedule that they had early in the season with so many road games and so many 3 and 4 nights and back-to-backs and things like that. You do wonder if like, all right, is this team practicing too much? And is this does this allow for a coach's message to get tuned out a little bit because these guys just like need a little bit of a mental health break? I don't know. I'm just, I think it's a possible scenario, but no, if you're doing the blame game thing for the Kings, Mike's lower on the list. I think some of his decisions and particularly rotations, and like the decision last night against the Nuggets to have Doug McDermott in the starting lineup. I think, having McDermott in the rotation makes sense. Having him start at the 4 against that team with Aaron Gordon, and Aaron Gordon had 14 points in the first quarter last night. Like, I think, that's a decision that you could look at and say, all right, like Keon Ellis would make more sense. Jay Crowder would make more sense, in my opinion. Like, so yeah, no coach is perfect. And to your point, I think Mike certainly is not completely blameless in this.
This episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by Robinhood and Robinhood Gold. With Robinhood Gold, you don't need a silver spoon to eat up the financial favors of the 1%. Robinhood Gold allows others to get the rates and perks usually reserved for the high society. Now, the resourceful individual with Robinhood Gold can earn the very liberal rate of 4.25% APY on uninvested cash and be rewarded with a handsome 3% retirement boost on an IRA account contribution. Robinhood Gold provides the privileges of a high net worth for any net worth. These generous benefits are now available for only $5 a month. The new gold standard is here with Robinhood Gold. Sign up at robinhood.com/gold. Terms apply. For product-specific disclosures, visit robinhood.com/gold. Investing involves risk. Rate may change. Gold membership is offered by Robinhood Gold, LLC. Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? That definitely happened for me. I had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It monitors your spending and it helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. For me, one of the best features is the subscription tracker. I used it to cancel services I wasn't using anymore, and I already saved a ton of money. Plus, with their goals feature, I've been able to automatically set aside money for the future. No more stressing about budgeting every month. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. I think the biggest area of Mike that is an issue for him is I think Mike Brown's a stubborn person. I think he's stubborn and he's very firm in what he believes in. And it takes a lot to kind of change his mind or knock him off that. And he shared with us, like, coming into the season, this new emphasis on crashing the glass and crashing and offensive rebounding. That came from Monty McNair. And Mike challenged Monty a lot until Monty explained it to him and the coaches kind of explained it to him. So he said, okay, we'll try it. And it kind of became a staple of this team. Mike is determined to bring out the absolute best of these players in areas where they aren't necessarily known for being good, like defense. Mike is determined to bring out the best defense that Malik Monk can offer, the best defense that Kevin Huerter can offer. That is, and I appreciate Mike for that in terms of being a developmental coach and believing in his players and holding his players accountable and not just putting them into a box of this is what you are and this is what you're going to be for our team. That being said, there are some times where Mike's own message, I think, works against him, and him being stubborn to not play guys or to play certain guys because he thinks he can get the most out of them. It comes back and kind of bites him in the butt, because there are so many times that I feel Mike has made decisions. I'll use an example here, and it sounds harsh, but it's the reality. The fact that Colby Jones is getting so many minutes right now. Like, I read into actions sometimes more than I read into words, especially when Mike Brown's words are the same thing pretty much every time we hear from him. I read into actions. And I felt this way for the last 2 years, Chris. Mike will play guys at certain times where it might as well be him turning to a camera like it's an episode of The Office and looking at the camera and going like, what do you want me to do? And I think that's what he's doing to Monty in this front office half the time. This is what you've given me. I think this team is so desperate for size that Mike, his stubbornness in playing Kevin Huerter, sure, it could feed into, like, and it makes perfect sense to want to raise his draft stock as much as possible, because I think he's the biggest name that the Kings have that's willingly going to be on the trade block at the trade deadline. So that makes tremendous amounts of sense. But I think Mike is also going, I don't have size. I need size. This dude's 6'6" and Keon's 6'3". I'm playing the 6'6" dude because that's the best thing I got. Or I'm playing Colby Jones because at least he has a little bit of a wingspan until Devin Carter shows up. I think the Kings are so desperate for size that Mike is playing whatever size he has. Isaac Jones is getting all these minutes, or was. That he's turning to Monty and going, this is what you've given me. This is what I'm playing with. There's a clear issue of size with this team. Go out and address it. That's where I feel like Mike is at this point.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong, and I also don't really know what the alternative would be. Like, do you play smaller? Like, do you play Jordan McLaughlin more? Like, what's really the alternative? Because, as is, the Kings are, I think, at a size deficit to just about every team they play.
Right.
And that's even when you have, Trey Lyles, who's your backup power forward and sometimes plays small ball 5.
But they knew that
right?
coming into this season, and
Right.
I love the DeMar DeRozan edition. And I will admit, the DeMar DeRozan edition pulled the wool over my eyes, or whatever the term is. And I think it pulled the wool over a lot of Kings fans' eyes, because here's this big name, and I think DeMar was a great addition for this Kings team. But they didn't address the issue, and the issue is still there, and it's costing them games nightly, that size issue.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the thing is, where the Kings are in a tough spot is, their big contracts. It's not like, if like Keegan Murray still has value because he's not on that second contract yet, right? Like, he's still affordable in the short term. And then if you do trade him, a team can, sign him to a contract of their liking or whatever, right?
Control.
Like, their big contracts are De'Aaron Fox, Domantas Sabonis, and DeMar DeRozan.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to get sizable upgrades, you need to ship out big contracts. Well, it doesn't really seem like there's much appetite to ship out any of their 3, quote unquote stars, right? So how do they get appreciably better? How do they get that athleticism? And they're kind of at a point where, yeah, they can make deals and they can use first round picks, but it's good. They're going to have kind of a hard time making a deal for, like, I was even messing around on the trade machine today.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Cam Johnson makes $22 million.
Mm-hmm.
It's gonna be difficult for the Kings unless they move, DeMar DeRozan or, whoever else. Like, unless they move a big salary, they're gonna have a hard time bringing back big salaries. And so even if you do package Kevin Huerter and Trey Lyles and draft picks or whatever, what's your depth look like? Because in my opinion, the Kings need multiple wings. They need multiple guys from 6'8" to 6'10" to add to the rotation, to provide a little bit of length and defense and versatility, which they don't really have right now. So I do think that they're in a tough spot from the way the roster is constructed from a contract standpoint, because in order to bring in a salary like Cam Johnson or even Kyle Kuzma, like, you need to ship matching salaries out. And it's kind of difficult unless you're willing to move on from DeMar DeRozan after, 3 months or whatever it's been, right? So I think there are upgrades for the Kings to make. I just think they also might be difficult for them to make, given what you're going to have to send out in order to get the depth pieces that you need to take your team to the next level.
I agree. I don't believe that the Kings are considering moving any of those 3, because I think the Kings would admit that moving any of those 3 is, 1, that this version of the team doesn't work, and 2, it's hard to move any 3 players of that caliber and get better. Like, that's why you see most people, when they trade their biggest contracts and their top players, that's when they're typically selling and rebuilding or retooling. So you're not trading one of those 3 players and expecting to get better and figure things out to make it to the playoffs. That being said, and this is totally an up in the air question, out of those 3, which one do you feel, if it came down to it, which one do you feel is the most likely to be moved? Not necessarily the one you would want to move, but the most likely to be moved. Because I have a feeling on this, but I don't want to even think about it.
Well, my answer might surprise you. I mean, when I was doing the trade machine, the deal that I thought, or the deal that matched up that kind of made sense to me, it's Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith coming back for DeRozan and Kevin Huerter. And like, the salaries match. And, you get a little bit younger. You're obviously a little bit different, but you do get more size and more defense while upgrading your 3-point shooting in the aggregate, right? Like, not saying either of those guys are better shooters than Kevin Huerter, although I think Cam Johnson's like 45% this year, and Dorian Finney-Smith is at 40%. So you change, obviously DeMar DeRozan's having a really nice season and scoring a bunch of points. But in terms of, 3-point shooting, you upgrade. And in terms of defense, I think you upgrade. But that's a tough move to make because you are trading out DeMar DeRozan. Does he want to do it? Does he have a no trade clause? Right? Do we even know? I looked it up. I didn't see anything about a no trade clause, so I'm not entirely sure how that would work.
I don't believe so.
But yeah, so it is difficult. And I think getting Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith would be huge for the Kings. I don't know how they can do that to make the salaries work, unless you are throwing a big salary back at them. And to me, the salary that makes the most sense in that particular deal is probably DeRozan's. But again, it seems unlikely. So I think the Kings are probably in a tough spot, and they don't seem like a team to me that is in position to trade away, do the Knicks Nets trade, for that included 5 first-round picks.
Yeah. And a star swap.
And the star swap. Yeah. I don't see that happening for them. So I do wonder if the Kings are going to need to get rid of a big salary in order to make these necessary adjustments.
Ultimately, I think the biggest takeaway from this conversation, Chris, is there's 2 major problems, and both of them are connected to each other because it's the same team and same organization, but both of them really have nothing to do with each other. The first one is Monte McNair needs to upgrade this roster. I think it's very clear, and I don't think Monte McNair can afford to wait till the trade deadline to do it. And even if it's just making one more move or 1 or 2 more moves to try and add some depth around the edges, because look what it did to Dallas last year. Look what it's done to Phoenix. There are teams and examples out there of it wasn't really working. You went out and addressed an issue with a couple role players, and it helped turn the team around. That's what I think the move is for Monte. So there's that has nothing to do with the players currently. The players that are here, though, they need to emphasize those little details better that Mike Brown talks about. And they just need to show an ability on the floor to correct these mistakes and not let them spiral and not rely on a timeout from Mike Brown to regroup them. I think that's just the takeaway from this conversation is there's 2 major issues. Both of them are all under the same Kings umbrella, but each one doesn't have to do with each other. The players that are here need to clearly figure it out, but there needs to be another player or 2 here from a Monte McNair standpoint. That's the only thing that I can point to that makes realistic sense of what the Sacramento Kings can actually do and how they can approach this season outside of opening up the trade machine or opening up NBA 2K and just trading everybody away and completely restarting, which this team is not in a position to do. They're not going to do because Monte McNair hitting the reset button is also, I think, Monte McNair punting on his career here in Sacramento.
So you think Monty is signing his death wish if he does something like trades for Zion Williamson?
I think that screams of desperation. And that's where if Monty gets out of pocket, because he's been very consistent with who he is, been very patient, not willing to pull the trigger unless it's something that he firmly believes in. I will give him credit when it's felt like he needs to make a sizable move. He's done that with the DeRozan signing or with the Domantas Sabonis Tyrese Halliburton trade. When he feels like he needs to do something, he does it. He does something that at least changes something for the Kings. So that's why I expect something's going to happen. But he's also had 2 trade deadlines in a row where he's done next to nothing other than bringing in Kessler Edwards. So if Monty were to all of a sudden go, yep, we're getting Zion, or yep, here's 5 first-round picks for Cam Johnson, then that screams of desperation. And if you're getting desperate, that means the seat is hot, and that could create results that could also bury this team for the foreseeable future where he gets fired and the Kings have no draft picks until 2035.
Yeah, it's tough. One thing too that's worth noting is, with the Kings being kind of close to the first apron, I think I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but they're pretty close.
They're close.
I don't think there's a ton of appetite to add salary. So this goes back to the idea of matching salaries, because if you're trading a bunch of draft picks and you're not necessarily matching active salaries, then you're taking on salary and you're flirting with that second apron or that first apron. And we know the aprons are far more punitive under the new CBA when it comes to team building and flexibility in terms of how you do that. So, I do think it's complicated. It's interesting. And in my opinion, unless the Kings are willing to move one of their big salaries, I think their upgrades are going to come on the margins, and it's going to be, a Kevin Huerter type salary. Maybe you package Kevin Huerter and Trey Lyles for one player who's better than both, but then are your depth issues solved, right? Do you have the required depth that you need to get to and win a playoff series, right? So, it's a tricky spot. I think, the Kings are in a really tricky spot right now, and maybe they just play themselves out of it. Maybe they get Keegan Murray back healthy. Maybe, Kevin Huerter comes back, continues his hot shooting. Maybe Trey Lyles comes back. And then all of a sudden you're looking at this team as it was designed, playing at a much better level. But until then, you're looking at this team and the rest of the Western Conference and saying, they got to make some sizable upgrades, literally and figuratively, in order to, get to a top 6 seed and potentially win a playoff series.
Well, this concludes Chris Biderman and Matt George trying to fix the Sacramento Kings, and I think we ran out of duct tape and nails. So we're gonna see what Monty McNair, Mike Brown, the players, everybody tries to do to salvage the season. Because one thing's for sure, the expectation is very clear: it's playoffs. Like, that's the expectation set by themselves, set by ownership. And I've had some fun with the camera zooming in on Vivek Ranadive sitting courtside the last handful of games, and I'll just say my man doesn't look too pleased with what's going on. So things will happen. Things are going to happen. So we'll see what route the Sacramento Kings go. But Chris will always be covering it for the Sacramento Bee, whether he's on the road with the team, hopping on planes and making ridiculous road trips, or here in Sacramento inside the Golden One Center, where the Kings will be a lot over the next month or so. Chris, I appreciate you, my friend. Thanks so much. Happy holidays to you, brother. And I'll see you back at the Golden One Center very soon.
Likewise. See you Thursday.